So I think there are two issues in terms of informed consent in cluster randomised trials. One is about the process of informed consent and the other is about ethics. So in terms of the process, the key thing about cluster randomised trials is that you're randomising clusters. So participants don't get a chance to decide whether they get randomised or not. That decision is made by the cluster. So in a cluster randomised trial, the most that any individual participant can consent to is to consent to participate and consent to have their data collected. They can't consent to randomisation. And that's a bit different from individually randomised trials, because in individually randomised trials, you would normally consent participants to participate, to randomisation, and to have their data collected all at the same time. And that doesn't happen in a cluster randomised trial. So in a sense, the three elements of consent are disaggregated. The other thing about a cluster randomised trial is very often you have an intervention, which means that participants are in a sense consenting to the intervention as part of routine practice. So what that means is that in many cluster randomised trials, actually the only thing that participants get to consent to as part of the trial itself is the data collection. And so I think it's really important that people understand that the process is slightly different in cluster randomised trials, and there's this disaggregation of the consent process. And people need to be very clear about what it is that they are consenting their participants to. In terms of ethics, the best guidance on how to handle consent processes and other ethical issues in cluster randomised trials is the Ottawa Statement on the Ethics of Cluster Randomised Trials, which was published in 2012. It's an excellent piece of work. It was done by a large research team in Canada, and it was the culmination of a lot of work, and it's got some really, really good recommendations in it. So I would recommend that anybody who is doing a cluster randomised trial actually looks at that piece of work. In terms of consent, one of the key things that that document does is it identifies very clearly criteria for assessing whether individuals within a trial are participants or not. So it has 4 criteria. It says that if an individual either has an intervention directly aimed at them, or the intervention affects their environment, even if it's not directly aimed at them, or they have data directly collected from them, or they have identifiable data collected from routine sources. If any one of those things is true, then they are a participant in the trial. What that means is that if they don't fulfill any of those criteria, then they're not a participant in the trial. So sometimes you can have individual patients who are not participants. Conversely, you can have health professionals who satisfy one of those criteria, and therefore they are classed as participants. But that whole area about who is a participant and therefore who needs to have consent taken from them, I don't think those ideas have really got out into the research community. But that idea of who is a participant does obviously have an influence on who you should collect your consent from. The other issue, ethical issue, is that sometimes the way that you take consent can cause bias. So that, for example, the most common way that this happens is when you are recruiting individual participants after you've randomised. So the cluster and the person, often the person recruiting, may know whether the individual is in an intervention cluster or in a control cluster. And in those circumstances, sometimes people use different forms of consent for the intervention and the control. They might, for example, tell the intervention participants that they are in the intervention and tell the control participants that they are in the control. What often happens then is you get differential consent in your two groups. So in one group you may get far more consenting than in the other group. And that may cause bias. So in order to avoid that, there are a number of things that you can do, and there have been papers written on that. But it's really, really important that in those circumstances you do try and make sure that the participants are being recruited in exactly the same way in your intervention and control group. If that doesn't happen and you get bias, you've got an unethical trial anyway, because it's not ethical to conduct a trial which is not scientifically sound. So it's really, really important that for that particular issue, people understand that sometimes it may look ethical to ask consent in two different ways in the intervention and control, but in fact, at the end of the day, it's not. In certain cases, there may be no other way to ensure that you get the same sort of thing happening in your intervention and control groups than to say, we can't take consent in this trial. And in those very rare cases, an ethics committee will sometimes give you a waiver of consent. But it's important that people understand that issue in the first place in order to avoid the problems.